Picture a battlefield swallowed by time, dusty banners fluttering in the wind, the clang of steel fading into silence, and the fate of nations decided in a single day, only to vanish from memory. History has a way of spotlighting the same familiar clashes: Agincourt, Hastings, the Crusades, while countless other battles slip into darkness, their echoes lost beneath centuries of dust. Yet these forgotten fights often held the power to tilt the scales of entire civilizations, redrawing maps and rewriting futures in ways we've barely begun to understand. What if the medieval world as we know it was shaped not by the wars we remember, but by the ones we've nearly erased? Take a step off the beaten path with me, and you'll find a tapestry of hidden turning points, where lesser-known kings, mercenaries, and rebels clashed in struggles just as pivotal as any textbook showdown. Imagine the shockwaves of a single ambush in the forests of Bohemia that toppled a dynasty, or the bloody siege in southern Italy that redirected the flow of Mediterranean trade for generations. These aren't footnotes, they're seismic shifts disguised as minor skirmishes, their true impact buried under layers of time. And that's the mystery we're unraveling today. How could so many battles that decided the fates of millions simply vanish from our collective memory? The answer lies in the messy, uneven lens of history where victors wrote the records, chroniclers favored dramatic tales over quiet revolutions, and some conflicts were simply too distant or chaotic to be neatly recorded. But now we're piecing together the fragments, from the rain-soaked fields of Ireland where a rogue warlord's defiance changed the island's destiny, to the sun-scorched plains of Spain, where a single cavalry charge preserved a kingdom against impossible odds. Each of these 25 battles holds a key to understanding the medieval world in a whole new light. This isn't just a list, it's a journey into the shadows where the whispers of forgotten warriors finally get their due. So ready your curiosity, we're about to rewrite the map of history, one overlooked battle at a time. The year was 937, and the fate of England hung in the balance not on the famous fields of Hastings, but in a muddy nowhere called Brunnenberg, a place so lost to time we still debate its exact location. Picture this: a Viking horde storming ashore, allied with the Scots and the Strathclyde Welsh, their combined forces threatening to tear apart the fragile unity of Anglo-Saxon England. Against them stood King Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, with an army that represented something radical for its era, a coalition of Englishmen from Wessex, Mercia, and beyond, fighting not as separate kingdoms but as one people. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment England decided what it wanted to be. Athelstan's victory was a masterpiece of medieval strategy. While the Vikings relied on their usual brutal frontal assaults, the Anglo-Saxons used the terrain like chess players, funneling their enemies into killing zones where shield walls crumbled under disciplined volleys of spears and axes. The chroniclers wrote of the field running red for miles, with 5 kings and 7 earls left dead by sunset. Yet what's truly shocking isn't the bloodshed, it's how quickly Brunnenberg faded from memory. Unlike Hastings, where the victors etched their triumph into legend, Athelstan's win was oddly downplayed, almost as if the very idea of a united England made later rulers uneasy. Why the silence? Maybe because Brunnenberg's legacy was too subtle for the medieval mind. There were no castles seized, no crowns exchanged, just the quiet realization that fractured kingdoms could stand together against chaos. For the first time, the concept of England wasn't just a dream of scholars, it was a reality forged in steel, and that's the tragedy of forgotten battles. The ones that change everything often leave the faintest scars. While Hastings gets the glory, Brunnenberg did the harder work, turning tribes into a nation, all in a single day. No one bothered to mark on the map. Nearly 3 centuries after Brunnenberg reshaped England's destiny, another forgotten clash was unfolding a continent away, one that would quietly dictate the spiritual and political future of Eastern Europe. In the sweltering summer of 971, Along the winding banks of the Danube, the fortress city of Dorostolon became the stage for a siege that pitted two rising powers against each other: the Byzantine Empire, struggling to reclaim its glory, and the Kievan Rus, a fledgling Slavic state hungry for expansion. What happened here over 3 brutal months didn't just decide the fate of a single city, it redrew the cultural map of an entire region. Byzantine Emperor John Tzimiskes arrived at Dorostolon with a force bristling with technological superiority, Greek fire, disciplined heavy cavalry, and centuries of military tradition. Facing him were the Rus, led by Prince Sviatoslav, a warrior king who'd spent his life carving out a domain from the Baltic to the Black Sea. On paper, it seemed like another routine border skirmish. But the stakes were far higher. Sviatoslav wasn't just raiding, he aimed to permanently settle the Balkans, threatening to turn the Danube into a Slavic river. Had he succeeded, the Orthodox Christian world might have fractured centuries before the Great Schism, leaving Constantinople isolated and vulnerable. The siege itself was a masterclass in endurance and adaptation. The Rus, though outmatched in siegecraft, used the dense forests and river networks to launch relentless guerrilla attacks, while the Byzantines countered with psychological warfare, parading captured soldiers in chains within view of the walls. By the 3rd month, starvation and desertion whittled down Sviatoslav's forces, but the real turning point came when Tzimiskes unveiled his secret weapon, armored cataphracts. These ironclad horsemen shattered the Rus' shield walls in a single decisive charge, forcing Sviatoslav to kneel in the dust and swear never to challenge Byzantine borders again. Yet the battle's true legacy wasn't written in blood, it was etched into faith and culture. The humbled Rus returned north with more than just shattered ambitions. They carried back Byzantine priests, art, and the Cyrillic alphabet. Within decades, Prince Vladimir, Sviatoslav's son, would famously convert to Orthodox Christianity, a direct consequence of Dorostolon's cultural aftershocks. The Balkans remained a Byzantine sphere, yes, but more importantly, the Rus became the spiritual heirs of Constantinople, shaping Russian identity for a millennium. It's staggering to think that a single siege, now barely mentioned outside academic circles, quietly determined whether Moscow would one day call itself the Third Rome. History's irony is palpable here. While we remember the Crusades as clashes of civilizations, Dorostolon proved that the most transformative conflicts often happened in the shadows. No epic poem celebrated Tzimiskes' victory, no icons immortalized the fallen, but the silence of the record books doesn't diminish its impact, it magnifies it. Some battles roar their importance, this one whispered, and the world listened without even realizing. The summer of 185 scorched the plains of Alarcos. With more than just heat, it burned away the illusion of Christian dominance in Iberia. While history books dwell on triumphs like Las Navas de Tolosa, the Battle of Alarcos remains a festering wound, a catastrophe so humiliating that medieval scribes practically erased it from their chronicles. Picture the scene: King Alfonso VIII of Castile, young and brash, leading his knights into what should have been a glorious rout of the Almohad Caliphate's forces. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. The Almohad Caliph al-Nasir wasn't just another Moorish ruler, he was a zealot with a vision of uniting all Islam under his banner, and Iberia was his proving ground. While Alfonso relied on traditional cavalry charges, al-Nasir's army was a nightmare of innovation. Berber skirmishers whittling down the Castilian flanks, African javelineers disrupting formations, and a corps of disciplined heavy infantry that stood like an iron wall. The result wasn't just a defeat, it was a massacre. Chronicles whisper of noble blood soaking the dirt, of captured knights paraded through Seville in chains, and of Alfonso himself fleeing the field in disgrace. But why did Alarcos vanish from Spain's collective memory? The answer reeks of political sabotage. Alfonso's rivals Leon, Navarre had refused to join his campaign, and after the disaster, they spun the narrative to paint him as a reckless fool rather than a martyr for Christendom. The Church, desperate to maintain morale, downplayed the loss as a minor setback. Even the surviving records are suspiciously vague, as if scrubbed clean of inconvenient truths. The battle's true cost wasn't measured in bodies, but in time. With Castile broken, the Reconquista ground to a halt for a generation, Moorish culture flourished anew, from the arches of Cordoba to the libraries of Granada. It would take 20 years and a miracle at Las Navas to undo the damage. Alarcos teaches us a brutal lesson: sometimes history's most pivotal moments aren't celebrated. They're buried along with the pride of those who couldn't bear to remember. History remembers Byzantium as the unshakable colossus of medieval Europe, a fortress of faith and power that weathered threats for 1,000 years. But in the blistering summer of 917, along the muddy banks of the Achelous River, that illusion nearly collapsed in a single afternoon. Tsar Simon of Bulgaria didn't just defeat the Byzantine Empire here. He orchestrated a massacre so complete that Constantinople's historians would later pretend it never happened. This wasn't just a battle, it was the birth of Europe's first Slavic superpower, achieved through one of the most cunning battlefield deceptions of the Middle Ages. Simon was no ordinary conqueror. Raised in Constantinople's glittering court as a hostage prince, he'd absorbed Byzantine tactics like a sponge, then turned that knowledge against his tutors. When Emperor Romanus Lecapenus marched north with the largest army assembled in decades, 60,000 strong, bolstered by Armenian mercenaries and elite Varangian guards, he expected to crush the Bulgarians like a bothersome revolt. Instead, he walked into a trap worthy of Sun Tzu. The Achelous was no random battleground. Simon had chosen it with surgeon's precision. Lush reeds concealed pits lined with wooden spikes. The river's curves forced the Byzantines into a cramped killing zone where their numerical advantage meant nothing, but the true masterstroke, feigned retreats, a tactic so brilliantly executed, it fooled not just Romanus, but later chroniclers too. As the Byzantine vanguard pushed forward, Bulgarian cavalry units would scatter in apparent panic, luring entire divisions into prepared ambushes. Contemporary accounts penned by shaken survivors describe the horror of watching armored knights sink into hidden bogs, their mounts impaled as Saxon axes rained down from camouflaged tree blinds. By dusk, the river ran thick with the bodies of imperial generals, their ornate armor stripped by peasant levies. The few Byzantines who escaped carried tales so humiliating that Constantinople's propaganda apparatus sprang into overdrive, scrubbing records and rebranding the disaster as a minor border incident. The battle's aftermath reshaped the continent. With the Byzantine army in tatters, Simon declared himself emperor of all Bulgarians and Romans, a direct challenge to Constantinople's prestige. His empire stretched from the Black Sea to the Adriatic, its borders patrolled by Slavic warriors who'd once been dismissed as barbarians. For the first time, a Slavic ruler minted coins bearing his own face, not the Byzantine emperor's. His capital, Preslav, became a crucible of culture where Greek manuscripts were translated into Old Church Slavonic, creating a literary tradition that would outlive Byzantium itself. Yet the greatest irony lies in the silence. While Western Europe obsessed over Charlemagne's legacy, Simon's Bulgaria became the continent's most sophisticated state, only to be erased from memory by the very empire he humiliated. Modern historians still piece together the truth from fragments, a passing mention in an Armenian chronicle, a Bulgarian monk's scribbled marginalia. The Battle of Achelous teaches us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by those who can't bear to admit defeat. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor and self-proclaimed heir to Charlemagne's legacy, expected the Lombard city-states to grovel like obedient children when he marched into northern Italy in the summer of 176. Instead, he found himself staring down the barrels of a revolution literally. The Battle of Legnano wasn't just a military upset, it was the moment ordinary citizens, armed with little more than crossbows and sheer defiance, shattered the myth of imperial invincibility. And yet, ask any modern Italian about this victory, and you'll likely get a blank stare. How could the clash that birthed Italian autonomy fade into obscurity? The Lombard League, a ragtag alliance of merchant republics like Milan, Venice, and Brescia, should have been crushed under the weight of Frederick's professional army. His knights, clad in gleaming plate armor, represented the pinnacle of medieval military might, but the Lombards had a weapon far deadlier than steel: civic pride. Picture weavers, blacksmiths, and even students forming militias, drilling in town squares after sundown. Their secret, the carroccio, a massive ox-drawn wagon carrying their city's banner, surrounded by a sworn brotherhood of defenders who'd rather die than let it fall. This wasn't just a battle standard, it was a symbol of something radical for the Middle Ages, the idea that collective identity could trump royal bloodlines. When Barbarossa's cavalry charged at Legnano, they expected to scatter peasants like chaff. Instead, they slammed into a wall of pikes and crossbow bolts, their horses tripping over hidden trenches dug the night before. The Lombards fought like cornered wolves, their carroccio serving as both rallying point and final redoubt. By day's end, Frederick's elite knights lay trampled in the mud, and the emperor himself was presumed dead until he crawled from beneath a pile of corpses days later, his aura of divine right stripped bare. The peace treaty that followed was unprecedented. For the first time, a Holy Roman Emperor acknowledged the right of cities to govern themselves through elected councils, not feudal oaths. The Lombard League's victory planted the seeds of the Renaissance 2 centuries early, proving that urban ingenuity could outmaneuver aristocratic tradition. So why isn't Legnano etched into Italy's national consciousness like Garibaldi's campaigns? Blame the Renaissance itself. Florence and Venice, eager to cast themselves as heirs to Rome's glory, downplayed their medieval roots as backward. Later nationalist movements obsessed with Roman antiquity skipped straight from Julius Caesar to Napoleon, leaving Legnano buried like a relic, but the battle's ghost lingers. That carroccio, it evolved into the modern Italian flag's tricolor, the oath-bound militias, precursors to today's civic activism. Legnano's real tragedy isn't that it was forgotten, it's that we forgot how ordinary people, united by a simple wagon, once bent history to their will. To understand the Battle of Varna, you have to grasp the sheer desperation of Christendom in the year 444. The Ottomans weren't just knocking at Europe's door, they were kicking it down. Constantinople, the last jewel of Byzantium, teetered on collapse. Pope Eugene IV, panicking, did something unprecedented. He ordered every able-bodied man from Poland to Sicily to drop their plows and take up the cross. The result, a rushed ragtag army of 20,000 Hungarians, Poles, Wallachians, even a contingent of Venetian sailors, led by a 20-year-old king who'd rather be writing poetry than leading a holy war. King Władysław of Hungary and Poland should have been studying philosophy in Krakow. Instead, he found himself knee-deep in Bulgarian mud, staring down Sultan Murad's 60,000 hardened veterans. The Ottomans weren't just numerically superior, they were tactically refined, with Serbian auxiliaries scouting the terrain and Anatolian archers raining arrows like clockwork. Yet against all odds, the Crusaders' initial charge nearly worked. Hunyadi Janos, the battle-hardened Transylvanian voivode, exploited a gap in the Ottoman lines so flawlessly that Murad's bodyguard began to buckle. For a fleeting moment it seemed divine intervention might tip the scales, then came the blunder that doomed Christendom. Władysław, perhaps drunk on the intoxicating idea of martyrdom, abandoned Hunyadi's careful strategy and led his personal knights straight into the Ottoman center, aiming for Murad himself. What happened next wasn't just a defeat, it was a slaughterhouse ballet. the Sultan's elite janissaries enveloped the king's squadron, their curved killage swords flashing. Witnesses later claimed Wladislaw's horse stumbled first, throwing him into the dirt where 5 spears found his body simultaneously. By dusk, his head adorned a pike outside Murad's tent, while the Danube ran red with noble blood. The battle's aftermath was even crueler than the fighting. Without Wladislaw, the crusade collapsed overnight. Hunyadi barely escaped with a remnant of the army, while Venice abandoned its Balkan outposts within months. But the real tragedy was psychological. Varna shattered Europe's illusion that the Ottomans could be stopped through sheer fervor. No grand coalition would form again for decades. Constantinople fell in 453, not because its walls failed, but because Christendom had already given up in 444. Yet history's greatest irony lies in what we chose to remember. While Lepanto and Vienna became rallying cries, Varna, the battle that truly decided the Balkans' fate, was quietly erased. The papacy, humiliated by its own failed prophecy, scrubbed the crusade from its narratives. Hungarian chroniclers, unwilling to dwell on their saintly king's tactical idiocy, spun it as a noble sacrifice. Even Ottoman accounts downplayed it, preferring to glorify later conquests. The truth, Varna wasn't just a battle, it was the moment Europe looked the East in the eye and flinched. And that's why it terrifies us into silence. History often rhymes, and nowhere does this echo louder than in the sun-scorched gorges of Anatolia, where the Byzantine Empire marched blindly into a nightmare it should have seen coming. 100 years after the disaster at Manzikert shattered Byzantine power in Asia Minor, Emperor Manuel Komnenos repeated history's cruel joke at Myriokephalon in 176. This wasn't just a battle, it was a meticulously orchestrated trap that sealed the fate of Anatolia forever. Yet while Manzikert became shorthand for imperial collapse, Myriokephalon lingers in obscurity not because it was less consequential, but because its lessons were too painful to memorialize. Manuel's campaign began with swaggering confidence, his army over 30,000 strong, including elite Varangian guards and Frankish mercenaries, was the largest Byzantine force assembled in a century. Their mission, to crush the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum once and for all, avenging Manzikert and reclaiming the fertile plains of central Anatolia. But the Seljuks, led by Sultan Kilij Arslan II, had spent decades mastering the art of asymmetric warfare. Where the Byzantines prized heavy cavalry and siege engines, the Seljuks perfected the deadly dance of feigned retreats and hit-and-run archery. Manuel's fatal mistake wasn't arrogance, it was forgetting that in Anatolia's labyrinthine valleys, numbers meant nothing. The pass near Myriokephalon became Kilij Arslan's killing jar, as the Byzantine columns snaked through the narrow gorge, stretching over 2 miles with no room to maneuver. Seljuk riders materialized from the cliffs above. Stones and arrows rained down, panicking pack animals that overturned wagons and blocked escape routes. The rear guard, commanded by Manuel's cousin Baldwin, was annihilated before they could draw swords. Up front, the emperor's vanguard fought desperately to carve an exit, only to find the pass's mouth barred by freshly felled trees. By dusk, the Byzantines had bled for every yard of retreat, leaving behind thousands dead and their precious siege train in Seljuk hands. What makes Myriokephalon's obscurity so baffling isn't the scale of defeat, but its long shadow. The battle didn't just cost territory, it shattered Byzantine psychology. Manuel's surviving troops burned their own supply depots during the retreat, a symbolic admission that Anatolia was no longer theirs to reclaim. Within decades, Seljuk caravanserais dotted lands that had been Byzantine for centuries, while Constantinople's emperors turned their gaze permanently westward. The true tragedy, Myriokephalon wasn't inevitable. Contemporary letters reveal Manuel ignored warnings from scouts about the terrain, while Kilij Arslan had actually offered generous peace terms before the battle terms the emperor dismissed as weakness. The silence of Byzantine chroniclers speaks volumes. Where Manzikert spawned epic laments, Myriokephalon earned only terse mentions, as if admitting the empire had learned nothing from its past. Modern historians argue that this deliberate forgetting stems from shame, not just over lost land, but over wasted potential. Manuel's reign had been Byzantium's last golden age, and Myriokephalon proved that even brilliance couldn't compensate for institutional amnesia. Today, the battle's legacy hides in plain sight. Those same Anatolian gorges now form the backbone of modern Turkey, their cliffs standing as silent sentinels to the moment Byzantium's Asian dream truly died not with a bang, but with a whisper. The alpine meadow at Sempach seemed an unlikely place to redraw the rules of medieval warfare. On a sweltering July morning in 1386, Duke Leopold III of Austria led his elite Habsburg knights, men encased in the finest plate armor money could buy, against what he assumed would be an easy target, a ragtag militia of Swiss peasants armed with nothing but 8-foot pikes and homemade halberds. History, however, had other plans. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the moment Europe's feudal order discovered that the humble foot soldier could topple its most arrogant assumptions. The Swiss Confederacy in 1386 wasn't yet a nation, just a loose alliance of mountain valleys united by their hatred of Habsburg taxes, their secret weapon. The Pike Square, a formation so revolutionary it might as well have been medieval trench warfare. Picture hundreds of farmers standing shoulder to shoulder, their pikes angled like a porcupine's spines, while halberdiers armed with axe-headed polearms darted between gaps to hook knights from their saddles. Against Leopold's cavalry charge, this living fortress held firm. Contemporary chronicles describe the carnage in visceral detail, armored nobles flailing like overturned turtles as Swiss farmers drove pikes through visor slits, the meadow's soil turning to a grisly paste of blood and churned earth. But Sempach's true innovation wasn't the pike, it was psychology. These weren't conscripted peasants fighting under feudal obligation, they were free men defending their homes, and that made them utterly unpredictable. When Leopold's reserve knights dismounted to attack on foot, a desperate gambit, the Swiss simply stepped back, let them exhaust themselves in heavy armor under the summer sun, then butchered them at leisure. By dusk, Leopold himself lay dead alongside 2,000 of his nobles, their corpses stripped of armor by the same hands that had milked cows that morning. The battle's aftershocks rippled far beyond the Alps. Suddenly, every king in Europe took note. Disciplined infantry could defeat knights at a fraction of the cost. French and German armies scrambled to hire Swiss mercenaries, while the Confederacy itself, buoyed by victory, formalized its alliances, laying the groundwork for modern Switzerland's famed neutrality. That meadow at Sempach didn't just birth a military tactic, it planted the seed of an idea that would blossom into Europe's oldest continuous democracy. Yet for all its world-changing impact, Sempach remains overshadowed by flashier conflicts, perhaps because it's easier to mythologize chivalrous knights than farmers with bloodied pitchforks. Or maybe because the Swiss, pragmatic to their core, never bothered to glorify their victory, they simply went home, buried the dead, and got back to work. But that's the paradox of forgotten battles. Sometimes, the quietest clashes echo the loudest through history. The Mongol horde that swept into Hungary in the spring of 1241 wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature honed to terrifying precision. At the Battle of Mohai, General Subutai didn't just defeat King Bela IV's forces, he redefined medieval warfare with a chilling display of psychological and tactical ingenuity. While Europe slept behind its stone walls, the Mongols executed maneuvers so advanced they wouldn't be replicated for centuries. This wasn't a battle, it was a masterclass in annihilation, delivered in under 6 hours. Subutai's genius lay in his grasp of terrain as a weapon. The Sajo River, which Bela's army assumed would protect their flank, became the hinge of their destruction. Under cover of darkness, Mongol engineers assembled prefabricated pontoon bridges, a technology utterly alien to European armies, allowing cavalry to cross undetected. Meanwhile, 7 stone-throwing siege engines, dismantled and transported hundreds of miles across the steppe, were reassembled overnight to rain hell on the Hungarian camp. These weren't the crude catapults Europeans knew. They were adjustable-range trebuchets capable of firing incendiary pots filled with naphtha, a primitive form of napalm that lit the pre-dawn sky with unnatural flames. But the real horror unfolded when the Hungarians, panicked by the bombardment, fled straight into Subutai trap. The Mongols had secretly cleared a hidden corridor through nearby marshes, herding their enemies like cattle into a killing zone where mounted archers could pick them off at leisure. Contemporary accounts describe knights drowning in their own armor, dragged under by the weight of their heraldry, while the Mongols, who never engaged in melee unless absolutely necessary, systematically exterminated them from a distance. By midday, 40,000 Hungarians lay dead, including nearly every noble family's heir. Chingbala escaped only by chance, fleeing on a wounded horse that later collapsed under him. What makes Mohai's obscurity so baffling isn't the scale of defeat, but Europe's willful blindness to its lessons. Subutai's army literally stood at the gates of Vienna before withdrawing upon news of the Great Khan's death, yet within a generation, Western chroniclers were dismissing the Mongols as Tartar savages rather than studying their tactics. French knights still trained for individual combat, while Mongol-style mobility and reconnaissance became the foundation of modern warfare. Even the revolutionary Hungarian reformer Matthias Corvinus, born 2 centuries later, would waste resources building obsolete castles instead of adopting Mongol-style light cavalry. The battle's darkest irony, while Mohai marked the end of Hungary as a regional power, its true casualty was Europe's collective imagination. For all their later victories against the Ottomans, Western knights never absorbed the Mongols' most vital lesson, that warfare isn't about glory, but adaptation. The siege engines that shattered Bela's army, they predated Western equivalents by 300 years, the feigned retreats that lured Hungarian knights to their doom. Still misunderstood as cowardice rather than strategy, in an alternate world where Europe heeded Mohai's warning, the Renaissance might have begun not with rediscovered Greek texts, but with stolen Mongol blueprints. Instead, the battle faded into myth, a nightmare so advanced, its victims couldn't even process what they'd witnessed. Rain lashed the fields near Stirling Castle in June 1314, turning the ground beneath Edward II's army into a quagmire, but the real mudslide was about to happen in England's treasury. The Battle of Bannockburn wasn't just Robert the Bruce's crowning moment, it was the financial earthquake that cracked open England's feudal system and forced a king to surrender power to his own parliament. While schoolchildren learned this clash as Scotland's David and Goliath triumph, its most revolutionary impact unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the accounting ledgers of London. Bruce's tactical genius has well documented how his Schiltron formations transformed spearmen into human fortresses, how he lured England's cavalry into hidden pits, but the real masterstroke was economic. Edward's campaign had been bankrolled by loans so vast they'd make modern hedge funds blanch. Italian bankers advanced the equivalent of £60 million today, secured against future Scottish taxes that would never materialize. When Bruce annihilated Edward's army, he didn't just win a battle, he vaporized England's credit rating. Contemporary chroniclers describe panicked merchants burning royal IOUs in the streets of Florence, while London's wool trade ground to a halt as creditors called in debts. What followed was a political domino effect. Bankrupt and desperate, Edward had to summon Parliament not as a ceremonial gesture, but to beg for emergency taxes. The nobles and burghers, sensing blood in the water, didn't just open the royal coffers, they forced Edward to reaffirm Magna Carta's long-ignored clauses, giving Parliament veto power over future wars. Suddenly, the document that had been gathering dust for a century became a living weapon against royal overreach. The irony: Bruce's victory inadvertently strengthened England's constitutional monarchy while weakening Scotland's. His successors, flush with battlefield glory, ruled unchecked until their own fiscal reckoning came centuries later. Meanwhile, England's humiliation at Bannockburn became the unexpected catalyst for representative government. That's the paradox of forgotten battles. Their loudest echoes often come from the unlikeliest places. While the clash of swords fades, the clink of coins and the rustle of parchment can reshape civilizations. July 15, 1410, dawn broke over the fields of Grunwald with a tension thicker than the morning mist. Beneath the banners of the Teutonic Order, Europe's most feared warrior monks stood ready to crush what they called the pagan hordes of Poland and Lithuania. But Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen had no idea his entire strategy had been compromised weeks earlier. Hidden in the baggage train of his own army rode a Polish spy, a man who'd memorized the Order's battle plans down to the last crossbow's placement. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was medieval espionage at its most audacious, setting the stage for the single bloodiest day in European history before the 20th century. The Teutonic Knights had ruled the Baltic through terror for 2 centuries, a state masquerading as a holy order, bankrolled by stolen amber and slave markets. Their fortress monasteries bristled with trebuchets and German steel, while their propaganda painted Polish King Władysław Jagiello as a barbarian king barely baptized. But Jagiello was no primitive. He'd spent years studying the Order's tactics, and his Lithuanian cousin Vytautas had survived their prisons. Together, they crafted a plan that turned the Teutons' greatest strength, their rigid discipline, into a fatal weakness. When the battle commenced, the knights' heavily armored cavalry charged straight into a masterpiece of misdirection. The Lithuanian wing, feigning panic, drew the Teutonic reserves into a miles-long pursuit through swamps and forests exactly as planned. Meanwhile, Polish heavy cavalry and Tartar horse archers encircled the remaining knights like a noose tightening. By afternoon, the field resembled a macabre sculpture garden, piles of dead knights so dense they formed makeshift walls, their white cloaks sodden with blood. Von Jungingen himself fell to a peasant's spear through his visor, his body looted by the very savages he'd vowed to exterminate. But Grunwald's true devastation wasn't on the battlefield, it was in the archives. For centuries, German chroniclers downplayed the defeat as a fluke, blaming everything from bad weather to divine punishment. The Order's surviving members rewrote their own histories, scrubbing mentions of their mercenary armies and slave-trading profits. Even today, many Western textbooks reduce Grunwald to a footnote, framing it as a regional skirmish rather than the earthquake it was. In reality, the battle shattered Teutonic power forever, enabling the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to emerge as Europe's largest state, a multicultural experiment that would last until the partitions of the 1700s. The darkest irony: Grunwald's legacy was buried not by the victors, but by later empires. Prussia's rise demanded a myth of German invincibility, while 19th-century nationalists ignored the battle's true lesson, that Slavic, Baltic, and even Muslim Tartar troops had fought side by side against a common foe. In our era of fractured identities, perhaps that's why Grunwald remains half-forgotten, not because it was insignificant, but because its vision of unity contradicts too many modern narratives. The Teutonic Knights built their legend on stolen land. Today we've let them steal the memory of their own downfall. Everyone knows the legend of Agincourt, how in 1415, England's Henry V led his exhausted, disease-ridden army to victory against a French force 3 times its size, thanks to the devastating power of the longbow. But what if the real turning point wasn't that muddy field at all? Behind the scenes, a far more insidious drama was unfolding, one where Burgundy's betrayal and the Treaty of Troyes didn't just reshape France's future, they nearly erased it from the map. The battle itself was pure carnage. French knights, weighed down by armor in the rain-soaked mud, became easy targets for English archers, picking them off like fish in a barrel. But here's the twist: Henry's triumph should have been a dead end. His army was starving, riddled with dysentery, and hopelessly outnumbered in hostile territory. Conventional wisdom said he'd be lucky to escape with his life, let alone conquer France. So how did a near-suicidal campaign turn into the prelude to English dominion? The answer lies not in the battlefield's chaos, but in the cold calculations of one man, Duke Philip of Burgundy, France's wealthiest and most treacherous noble. While the French crown was paralyzed by infighting between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, Philip saw an opportunity. Rather than uniting against Henry, he secretly opened negotiations with the English king, offering a deal that would shock even modern strategists. In exchange for recognizing Henry as heir to the French throne, Philip demanded virtual independence for Burgundy, a kingdom within a kingdom. The resulting Treaty of Troyes in 1420 didn't just disinherit the Dauphin, it declared France a hereditary possession of England's monarchs in perpetuity. Overnight, centuries of French sovereignty were nullified with a stroke of a pen, but the real tragedy wasn't the treaty's audacity, it was how close it came to succeeding. For nearly a decade, northern France functioned as an English satellite, with Parisian elites willingly switching allegiance. The Dauphin, holed up in Bourges, was mocked as the King of Bourges, while Henry's baby son was paraded through French streets as the rightful ruler. Only Joan of Arc's miraculous intervention and Philip's eventual cold feet saved France from permanent partition. Agincourt's legacy, then, isn't just about longbows and heroic last stands. It's a cautionary tale of how battlefield glory can blind us to the real wars fought in shadowed corridors, and sealed letters wars where the victor's pen can be deadlier than any arrow. The irony: we remember Henry's band of brothers speech, but forget the Burgundian dagger quietly pressed to France's back. History's greatest battles aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones whispered over parchment by men who never drew a sword. By the spring of 1450, England's grip on Normandy had become a cruel joke, a crumbling empire held together by mercenaries and nostalgia. The Battle of Formigny should have been one last desperate stand for English glory. Instead, it became the graveyard of medieval chivalry, buried under the roar of French cannons. While Joan of Arc's legend looms large in popular memory, it was here, on a quiet stretch of coastal road, that gunpowder permanently rewrote the rules of European warfare. And yet, ask anyone about the battle that truly ended the 100 Years' War, and you'll likely hear about Orleans or Castillon instead. Why has history airbrushed out the moment artillery replaced arrows as the great equalizer? The English commander, Thomas Cyril, arrived at Formigny with the last professional army England would ever field in France, a mix of grizzled longbow veterans and disgruntled Burgundian defectors. Their strategy was textbook Plantagenet: dig in behind sharpened stakes, let the French knights impale themselves on volleys of arrows, then counterattack. It had worked at Crécy and Agincourt, but France's new constable, Charles de Bourbon, wasn't playing by the old rules. Hidden behind a ridge, his engineers unloaded something revolutionary: 24 culverins, early cannons capable of punching through plate armor at 300 paces. These weren't the clumsy, ornamental bombards of previous decades. They were field artillery, mobile enough to relocate mid-battle. What followed wasn't a battle so much as a controlled demolition. As Cyril's archers loosed their first volley, the French guns erupted in synchronized fire, their iron shot carving ghastly furrows through the English ranks. Panic spread faster than the smoke. Without their protective stakes rendered useless against artillery, the longbowmen broke formation, only to be ridden down by Breton cavalry waiting for this exact moment. The handful of English knights who tried a desperate charge found themselves staring down the barrels of reloaded cannons at point-blank range. By dusk, Cyril sat chained in a French tent, while 4,000 of his men lay dead or captured. Normandy, held by England since 1417, fell within months. The tragedy of Formigny's obscurity lies in its timing. Just 3 years after the battle, Constantinople's walls would famously crumble under Ottoman cannons, an event that shocked Christendom into recognizing gunpowder's power. Yet here on a forgotten Norman field, that same revolution had already happened. The French didn't just win with artillery, they pioneered combined arms tactics, coordinating guns, cavalry, and infantry with a precision that wouldn't become standard for another century. Even the Ottomans sent observers to study these new methods, but history has a short attention span for quiet revolutions. Castillon in 1453, where cannons also decided the date eclipsed Formigny because it marked the war's official end. Joan's miracles made better propaganda than Bourbon's math, and England, humiliated, scrubbed the battle from its chronicles, preferring to mourn Agincourt's lost glory rather than confront its technological obsolescence. That's the cruelest joke of all. The battle that buried medieval warfare was itself buried by the very myths it rendered obsolete. The cannons of Formigny didn't just kill an army, they silenced their own echo. February 24, 1525, dawn crept over Pavia's foggy marshes to reveal a scene straight out of medieval nightmares. King Francis I of France, the last true knight of Europe, led a charge of gilded heavy cavalry against what he assumed would be a disorganized imperial army. Instead, he rode headlong into the future. Emperor Charles V's Spanish and German troops didn't just defeat the French that day, they staged a revolution in warfare so profound we're still misreading its origins. Because while textbooks call Pavia a Renaissance battle, its blood-soaked lessons were forged in tactics far older than anyone admits. At first glance, the clash had all the trappings of modern warfare: arquebusiers firing in disciplined volleys, cannons shredding through formations. But peel back the layers and you'll find a battle plan ripped from medieval playbooks. Charles' commander, the Duke of Pescara, didn't rely on gunpowder alone. He resurrected the Swiss pike squares of Sempach, pairing them with Moorish-style trench networks that funneled French knights into kill zones. Even the arquebusiers, those supposed heralds of modernity, fought under the banner of the Black Band's mercenaries, who'd honed their craft in Italy's endless petty wars, where ambushes and night raids were more common than grand battles. This wasn't just new tech defeating old, it was the dark arts of medieval irregular warfare scaled up with guns. The moment that sealed France's fate could have been lifted from a chivalric romance gone horribly wrong. Francis, his armor dented and horse slain, found himself surrounded by Spanish foot soldiers in a muddy orchard, when a Basque mercenary pressed an arquebus to his breastplate and demanded surrender. The king, true to his knightly code, offered his sword not to some lowborn soldier, but to Charles' noble officers. That gesture, equal parts bravery and absurdity, symbolized the era's violent transition. Heavy cavalry, the backbone of feudal power for 500 years, became obsolete in the time it took a matchlock's fuse to burn down. Yet historians cling to the Renaissance battle label because it fits a neater narrative that gunpowder alone toppled the medieval world, the truth. Pavia's real lesson was about adaptation, not technology. The imperial army succeeded because it blended old and new, German Landsknechts wielding 18-foot pikes alongside Spanish marksmen, trenches straight from Byzantine manuals protecting state-of-the-art artillery. Meanwhile, France's insistence on pure knightly charge after charge wasn't just outdated, it was willfully blind to centuries of proven asymmetric tactics. The battle's afterlife reveals even deeper ironies. Charles, despite his victory, soon found gunpowder empires harder to control than feudal vassals. The very mercenaries who won him Pavia would later sack Rome, proving that the tools of modern warfare could backfire spectacularly. As for Francis, his captivity birthed the Louvre's art collection. Ransom payments took the form of masterpieces by Da Vinci and Raphael. ceding France's cultural dominance even as its military model crumbled. Perhaps that's why we downplay Pavia's medieval roots. It's easier to blame gunpowder than admit that the old world didn't end with a bang, but with stubborn minds clinging to rusted ideals. The cannons were just the exclamation point. The battlefield of Kosovo in 1389 wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a collision of myths in the making. While Serbian ballads paint this as a heroic last stand against the Ottoman tide, the truth is far stranger, a murky stalemate where both leaders died, poisoned water decided the outcome, and the real victors weren't even on the field. Forget the legends of Prince Lazar's martyrdom. The battle's true legacy was 5 centuries of Balkan subjugation birthed from chaos, not conquest. Sultan Murad I arrived at Kosovo with an army already weakened by dysentery. His troops had been drinking from streams deliberately fouled by Serbian guerrillas days before. The Ottomans weren't the unstoppable force of later lore. They were exhausted, their supply lines stretched thin. Opposite them stood Lazar's coalition, a patchwork alliance of Serbs, Bosnians, and Albanians united less by patriotism than by fear. What followed wasn't some grand choreographed battle, but a grinding, day-long melee where neither side could gain decisive ground. The turning point came not from cavalry charges or tactical genius, but from a single act of deception. A Serbian nobleman named Miloš Bilić, feigning defection, slipped into Murad's tent and stabbed the Sultan through the heart with a poisoned dagger. Here's where history twists. Murad's death didn't trigger Ottoman collapse, it ignited a succession crisis that ironically strengthened their empire. His son Bayezid, warned of the assassination plot in advance, used his father's murder as pretext to strangle his own brother on the spot, eliminating his rival for the throne. By nightfall, both armies were leaderless, but while the Balkan nobles squabbled over succession, Bayezid raced back to Edirne to consolidate power. The Ottomans lost the battle yet won the war by default. Their centralized state absorbed the blow, while the fragmented Balkan alliance imploded into infighting. The myths we've inherited, Lazar's heavenly kingdom speech, the trope of noble sacrifice, were crafted centuries later by monks and nationalist poets. In reality, Kosovo's aftermath was less about heroism than missed opportunities. Venice's spies reported that Bayezid's forces were so depleted after the battle that a concerted Christian counterattack could have pushed them out of Europe entirely. Instead, the Balkans' rulers turned on each other, selling out rivals to the Ottomans for short-term gains. Within 70 years, Serbia became a puppet state, its nobility gradually replaced by Turkish governors. The cruelest irony, the poison that weakened Murad's army likely came from the same Balkan mines that later bankrolled Ottoman expansion. Silver from Novo Biardio paid for the cannons that shattered Constantinople's walls in 1453. Kosovo's fog of myth obscures a brutal lesson. Empires aren't always built on battlefield glory. Sometimes they rise from the ashes of mutual exhaustion, where the side that manages its chaos best survives. The Ottomans didn't conquer the Balkans that day, they outlasted them, rewriting a stalemate into destiny with every passing century, and that's why nationalist legends cling so fiercely to Kosovo, not because it was a heroic defeat, but because, admitting the truth, that fragmentation and distrust did more damage than any sultan's army, would unravel the very identities built upon its memory. The trumpets of Nicopolis sounded less like a call to glory than a funeral dirge for medieval Europe's crusading dreams. In September 1396, the largest Christian army, assembled since the fall of Acre, marched headlong into disaster, not through Ottoman superiority, but through a toxic cocktail of aristocratic arrogance and strategic delusion. Picture this: 20,000 French and Burgundian knights, their surcoats embroidered with fleurs de lis and golden crosses, charging uphill against entrenched janissary positions without scouts, reserves, or even a coherent battle plan. It wasn't warfare, it was a suicide pact dressed in silk. The Crusaders' fatal flaw wasn't courage, it was contempt. For weeks they dismissed reports of Sultan Bayezid's defenses as cowardly Saracen tricks. When Hungarian scouts warned of spiked trenches and camouflaged archer pits, the French commander, Count John of Nevers, literally laughed them off, insisting his heavy cavalry would scatter Turkish rabbits with a single charge. Even the seasoned Burgundian chronicler Jean Froissart, usually a cheerleader for chivalry, later admitted the nobles deliberately ignored veteran Hungarian troops' advice, fearing commoners might steal their glory. Bayezid, meanwhile, played them like a chess master. Knowing the Crusaders would fixate on frontal assaults, he stationed his least reliable troops, Serbian auxiliaries, as bait atop the ridge. As predicted, the French vanguard shattered these lines easily, only to find themselves exhausted on the summit, staring down at fresh janissary formations and a forest of hidden stakes. Then came the hammer blow, Ottoman Sipahi cavalry emerging from concealed gullies to sever their retreat. Within hours, the flower of European nobility was either dead or chained in ankle irons. But the true horror began after the battle. Bayezid, furious at his own heavy losses, ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners until his Serbian vassal Stefan Lazarevic intervened. The compromise, a ransom so colossal it bankrupted Burgundy, 200,000 gold florins for the nobles, while low-born soldiers were marched to Edirne's slave markets. Froissart's chronicle spins this as heroic martyrdom, but surviving letters from prisoners tell a different story of French dames sewing tapestries in Ottoman courtyards, and knights forced to build Bayezid's very palaces as enslaved laborers. Nicopolis' legacy isn't just a military lesson, it's a mirror to Europe's identity crisis. The Ottomans didn't just win a battle, they exposed the hollow core of crusading idealism, where vanity mattered more than victory. And the greatest irony, as French nobles languished in Edirne, their ransom payments funded the army that would crush Byzantium 50 years later. The crusade meant to save Christendom ended up bankrolling its greatest disaster. The marshes of Tannenberg in July 1410 were supposed to be a killing field, but not for the men the Teutonic Knights expected. While history remembers the German defeat here in 1914, the original Battle of Tannenberg 3 centuries earlier was where Europe's balance of power quietly shifted. Imagine the scene: Polish King Władysław Jagiello's army, a swirling mosaic of Polish knights, Lithuanian peasants, and Tartar horse archers, facing the Teutonic Order's gleaming columns of steel-clad warriors. On paper, it looked like civilization versus savagery. In reality, it was about to become a masterclass in turning medieval prejudices into deadly weaknesses. The Teutonic Grandmaster, Ulrich von Jungingen, made 2 fatal assumptions. First, that his heavy cavalry could smash through any eastern rabble. Second, that rivers were obstacles rather than opportunities. Jagiello exploited both. While the knights fretted over fording the Diawecker River, Lithuanian scouts had already mapped hidden shallows, allowing entire divisions to flank unseen. Then came the psychological warfare, Tartar riders feigning panic in perfectly timed retreats, luring overconfident Teutonic squadrons into bogs where their armor became death traps. Contemporary chronicles describe the horror of knights drowning face down in shallow water, their visors clogged with mud, while peasant infantry finished them off with hooked polearms designed to yank riders from saddles. But the real revelation comes from archaeology. Excavated mass graves near Grunwald, the battle's Polish name, tell a grimmer story than the chronicles. Forensic analysis shows many Teutonic corpses bear wounds from cheap, mass-produced weapons, not noble swords, but reforged farming tools and repurposed hunting spears. The Order's elite weren't just outmaneuvered, they were overwhelmed by an enemy that treated warfare as improvisation rather than ritual. Even the famed fallen knight diorama in Krakow's museum, based on these finds, gets it wrong. The reconstructed armor is pristine, while the actual bones show dents from repeated blunt trauma, evidence of peasants bludgeoning knights to death with rocks when steel failed. The battle's aftermath rewrote Central Europe's future, with the Order's leadership annihilated. Von Jungengen's body reportedly took 18 stab wounds. Their slave trading state crumbled overnight. Jagiello's victory didn't just secure Polish-Lithuanian dominance, it proved that diverse armies could outperform monocultural ones. Lithuanian light cavalry, Polish heavy infantry, and Tartar horse archers each played specialized roles, a model later adopted by everyone from Swedish kings to Ottoman sultans. Yet Western chroniclers, clinging to chivalric myths, dismissed Tannenberg as a fluke of barbarian numbers, ignoring its tactical brilliance. That deliberate misremembering speaks volumes. The Teutonic Knights spent centuries rebranding themselves as noble crusaders rather than slavers who'd built an empire on stolen Baltic land. By downplaying their catastrophic defeat, they preserved the myth of Western military superiority, a fiction that would echo through colonialism's darkest chapters. Today, as historians piece together the battle's true story from arrowheads and dental records, we're left with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the fights erased from memory are the ones that scare the victors most. Not because they were insignificant, but because they revealed too much. Rain turned the fields of Crecy into a quagmire in August 1346, but the real deluge would drown an entire financial system 800 miles away. While history remembers this clash as the longbows coming out party, its most devastating shockwaves rippled through the ledgers of Florentine bankers, men who'd never held a sword but would lose fortunes because of one. The Medici dynasty, the Renaissance's most infamous power brokers, owe their empire to this very catastrophe. How could a battle fought by English yeomen and French knights collapse Italy's economy? The answer lies in the murky intersection of medieval warfare and high finance. Where arrows weren't the deadliest projectiles, unpaid debts were. Edward III's campaign wasn't just a military operation, it was a pyramid scheme wrapped in chivalric pomp. To fund his invasion, the English king had borrowed astronomical sums from Florentine banking houses like the Bardi and Peruzzi, the 14th century's equivalent of hedge funds. These loans, secured against future plunder from French territories, assumed Edward would repeat his ancestors' victories. Instead, Crecy became a bloodbath with an ironic twist, winning too decisively. Edward's longbowmen slaughtered thousands of French nobles, but dead men don't pay ransoms. Without prisoners to sell back, England's war chest evaporated overnight. The financial dominoes fell with eerie precision. Florence's banks had overextended, using deposits from wool merchants and church dioceses to bankroll Edward's ambitions. When repayment deadlines passed, panic spread through the city's guild halls like plague. The Peruzzi firm collapsed first, dragging down smaller lenders in a credit crunch that would make modern economists wince. Within 2 years, even the mighty Bardi financiers to popes and kings shuttered their tables, their account books a graveyard of red ink. Enter Giovanni de' Medici, a shrewd wool trader who'd avoided the Edwardian debt trap. As his competitors drowned in bad loans, he began quietly buying up their assets for pennies on the florin. His secret, recognizing that the real money wasn't in funding wars, it was in controlling the aftermath. While others chased nightly glory, the Medici built a shadow empire on papal banking contracts and currency exchanges, turning Crecy's financial wreckage into their stepping stones. The battle's lasting lesson isn't about bows or tactics, it's about unintended consequences. Edward's victory inadvertently birthed modern banking's golden rule: never lend to kings. Those unpaid English debts accelerated innovations like double-entry bookkeeping and credit insurance, as Italians sought ways to hedge against royal whims. Even the word bankrupt entered the lexicon around this time, from the Italian bankerota, literally, a broken moneylender's bench. Crécy's arrows rusted long ago, but its financial aftershocks shaped capitalism itself. The next time you swipe a credit card or check a stock portfolio, spare a thought for those muddy French fields where the true casualties weren't knights, but the very idea that war could turn a profit. The summer heat of 1212 scorched the plains of Las Navas de Tolosa, where the largest Christian army ever assembled in medieval Spain, prepared to deliver what they believed would be the killing blow to Al-Andalus. Pope Innocent III had declared this a holy crusade, promising eternal salvation to any knight who joined, but what unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was a tragic miscalculation that would extend Muslim rule in Iberia for centuries, all because the victors misunderstood the very people they'd conquered. King Alfonso VIII of Castile led a coalition so vast, it astonished contemporary chroniclers, 60,000 men, including Templars, French knights, and even rival Christian kings, who'd temporarily set aside feuds. Facing them stood the Almohad Caliph al-Nasir, whose army, though outnumbered, held the high ground with a fortress-like camp ringed by chained slave soldiers. The Christians saw this as a divine test. What they didn't see was how their own propaganda had united a fractured Muslim world against them. For years, the Almohads had been losing influence, their puritanical rule alienating Al-Andalus's cosmopolitan cities. But Alfonso's crusade, framed as an existential war against Islam, gave al-Nasir the perfect rallying cry. The battle itself was a slaughter. Christian knights, fueled by crusading zeal, broke through the slave-soldier lines in a frenzy, massacring even those who surrendered. Chronicles boast of rivers choked with bodies, of caliphal tents looted for gold and relics, yet this glorious victory had an unintended consequence. It didn't destroy Al-Andalus, it radicalized it. Survivors fled south, carrying tales of Christian atrocities to cities like Granada and Seville. Overnight, moderate Muslim rulers who'd once tolerated Christian vassals now embraced hardline policies, expelling non-Muslim scholars and burning libraries that had thrived under earlier, more open dynasties. The intellectual golden age of Al-Andalus, with its famed translators and philosophers, began its irreversible decline. The refugee crisis that followed reshaped Iberia's cultural landscape. Thousands of Andalusian Jews and Mozarabic Christians once protected under Muslim rule found themselves caught in the backlash, fleeing north into hostile Christian territories or across the Mediterranean. Toledo, recently conquered by Castile, became a ghost town of abandoned workshops and empty universities. Meanwhile, the Almohad successors, the Nasrids, dug in at Granada, fortifying the Alhambra and vowing never to compromise with the Christian north. Las Navas didn't end Muslim Spain, it created a fortress mentality that prolonged the Reconquista by 300 years. The bitter irony, the battle's architects never grasped their own role in this disaster. Alfonso returned to Castile hailed as a hero, oblivious to how his triumph had hardened the lines between faiths. Even the Pope's jubilant letters failed to mention the thousands of Christian refugees now streaming into his own territories, their communities destroyed by the very crusade meant to save them. History remembers Las Navas as a turning point, but not in the way the victors imagined. Sometimes the surest way to strengthen your enemy isn't by losing to them, it's by winning so brutally you leave them no choice but to fight forever. Bouvines in 1214 should have been just another skirmish in France's endless feudal squabbles, until King Philip Augustus turned it into a masterclass in political judo. Picture the scene, a sweltering July afternoon near the Flanders border, where the French king's outnumbered army faced a nightmare coalition of English, Flemish, and German forces. Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, had personally marched west to crush Philip, while England's King John, desperate to reclaim Normandy, bankrolled the campaign from across the Channel. On paper, France was doomed, but Philip wasn't fighting for territory, he was playing chess while everyone else brawled in the mud. The battle itself was a messy, sprawling affair, 12 hours of brutal combat where the tide turned on something as absurd as a misplaced bridge. As Edo's knights charged across the Mark River, their weight collapsed the wooden crossing, trapping half their army on the wrong side. Philip's lighter cavalry exploited the chaos, encircling the isolated German knights like wolves picking off stragglers. But the real prize wasn't on the battlefield at all. Amid the carnage, French infantry captured Count Ferrand of Flanders, a rebellious vassal whose ransom demands would soon redraw Europe's power map. Here's where Bouvin's ripple effects dwarfed its bloodshed. With Ferrand in chains, Philip drained Flanders' treasury dry, funding fortifications that would secure northern France for centuries. But the shockwaves reached far beyond Paris. England's King John, his allies shattered and war chest emptied, returned home to face a revolt from his own barons. Within a year, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, not because they suddenly believed in human rights, but because Bouvines had bankrupted his ability to resist. That scrap of parchment, often hailed as democracy's birth certificate, was really born from a French king's battlefield accounting. The irony: Philip never intended to reshape England's government. He simply wanted to punish a disloyal count, but medieval geopolitics worked like a game of falling dominoes. Tilt one piece, and the whole board trembles. Bouvines proved that sometimes the battles history remembers aren't the ones that change the world. It's the overlooked clashes where a single prisoner, a collapsed bridge, or an emptied treasury quietly bends the arc of power. While French children still learn Bouvines as their Agincourt, its true legacy lies 800 miles away, in the quiet clauses of a charter that would one day inspire revolutions its signers couldn't have imagined. And that's the hidden lesson of these forgotten battles. The greatest consequences often wear the plainest disguises. A king fights for gold and land, and accidentally hands a quill to the people. A bridge breaks and constitutions get written. History doesn't always pivot on epic last stands. Sometimes it turns on a count's ransom receipt, tucked away in some Parisian vault. Everyone remembers the Norman arrows at Hastings, those lethal rainstorms of steel that supposedly carved England's destiny into the Bayeux Tapestry. But what if the real turning point happened 3 weeks earlier, on a muddy riverbank 300 miles north? The Battle of Stamford Bridge in September 1066 wasn't just a prelude to Hastings, it was the logistical nightmare that doomed Anglo-Saxon England before William's fleet even left Normandy. And the man who orchestrated this disaster wasn't the conqueror, but a forgotten Viking king who nearly stole England out from under both of them. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, wasn't just another raider chasing silver. This was a warrior who'd fought from Constantinople to the Arctic, a tactician so ruthless he'd once blinded Byzantine emperors with reflected sunlight off his shields. When he landed near York with 10,000 men, a mix of Norwegian veterans and English rebels, he wasn't testing the waters. He was staging a full-blown coup, backed by Harold Godwinson's own brother Tostig, who'd turned traitor after a bitter feud. The speed of their advance was terrifying. York fell in days, its citizens swearing allegiance to Harold as if William's looming invasion was someone else's problem. Then came Harold Godwinson's march, a feat of endurance that would break modern special forces. Hearing of the Viking threat while guarding England's south coast, the Saxon king force marched his huscarls 250 miles in just 4 days. That's 60 miles a day in chainmail, crossing rivers and forests without roads, let alone supply lines. When they burst upon Harold's camp at Stamford Bridge, the Norwegians were caught literally bathing in the river, their armor stacked on the banks. The Saxons slaughtered them like sheep, with Harold dying from an arrow through the throat mid-battle cry, "It should have been England's finest hour." Instead, it was the beginning of the end, because here's the twist Hastings doesn't want you to know: William's invasion wasn't some brilliant ambush. Harold knew the Normans were coming. He'd positioned troops to stop them before Harold even sailed. What nobody anticipated was the catastrophic timing. With his army exhausted from Stamford Bridge, many wounded, all starving, Harold had to turn around and march back south immediately, covering the same brutal distance in even worse condition. By the time they faced William at Hastings on October 14th, the Saxon huscarls weren't just outnumbered, they were running on empty. The battle's iconic shield wall held for hours because that's what huscarls did, they died standing. But fatigue breeds mistakes, and when a handful broke formation to chase fleeing Normans, likely a feigned retreat, the entire line collapsed, those famous arrows. They were just the coup de grace. The real killing blow had been delivered weeks earlier, on the road between York and Hastings, where England's fate was decided not by weapons, but by the limits of human stamina. The cruelest joke, William almost missed his chance. Bad winds had trapped his fleet in Normandy for months. If Harold had invaded just 2 weeks later, the Normans might have landed first, letting Harold fight one battle fresh instead of two shattered. History loves tidy stories of divine winds and missed opportunities, but Hastings was never about destiny. It was about a calendar, a map, and a Viking king who almost rewrote everything. The Normans didn't conquer England because they were stronger. They won because Harold's army had already bled itself dry saving it. The dusty plains near Tours in 732 have been mythologized as Christianity's bulwark against Islam's tidal wave, but peel back the layers of legend, and you'll find a far messier truth. Charles Martel's victory wasn't the decisive stand of popular imagination. It was a brutal skirmish against a raiding force that had already overextended itself. The Umayyad troops led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi weren't the vanguard of some grand invasion. They were a mobile column weighed down with loot from sacking Bordeaux, their real objective plunder, not permanent conquest. Yet medieval monks would later spin this clash into a cosmic showdown, and the reason has less to do with battles and more to do with backroom deals in Rome. Here's what the chronicles omit: the Umayyads had no supply lines stretching back to Al-Andalus, no siege engines to take fortified cities, no plan to hold territory north of the Pyrenees. Their strength lay in speed and surprise, not occupation. When Martel's Frankish infantry shattered their lines near Tours, it wasn't a war-ending blow, it was the equivalent of cutting off a raiding party's retreat. The real credit for stabilizing Christian Europe belongs to Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, whose decades-long campaigns in the late 8th century pushed Muslim forces permanently south and carved out the Spanish March as a buffer zone. So why did Tours get all the glory? Blame the Carolingian propaganda machine. By the 9th century, the Vatican had a vested interest in painting Martel as Christendom's savior. Papal scribes eager to secure Frankish protection against Lombard threats discovered documents likely forged claiming Pope Gregory III had begged Martel for help against the Umayyad menace. Never mind that Gregory's actual letters never mentioned Tours, or that the battle barely registered in contemporary Muslim chronicles. The monks rewriting history had a blueprint to follow. Just as Constantine's mythical vision at Milvian Bridge cemented church-state alliances, Martel's legend would bind the Franks to Rome's destiny. The irony: Martel himself was no pious defender of the faith. He'd seized power by overthrowing his own king, looted church lands to fund his armies, and died excommunicated for refusing to tithe. His victory at Tours mattered less for its immediate impact than for what it symbolized. Once Charlemagne's empire needed origin myths, medieval Europe, starved for heroes after Rome's collapse, recast a frontier skirmish as civilization's last stand, not because it changed the war, but because it sold a story. And stories, as any conqueror knows, are the real currency of power. The August sun blazed over the plains of Lechfeld in 955, but the real heat came from Otto the Great's fury. For decades, the Magyars had terrorized Europe with their lightning raids, burning monasteries, enslaving villagers, and vanishing back into the steppes like ghosts. But this time they'd picked the wrong target. Otto didn't just want to repel them, he aimed to annihilate them so thoroughly that no Magyar would ever dare cross the Danube again. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the birth certificate of Germany itself, signed in blood and blessed by an empire-building pope. Most retellings fixate on Otto's heavy cavalry, the proto-knights who would later dominate medieval warfare. But the real game-changer at Lechfeld was a corps of Bohemian axemen, loaned to Otto by Duke Boleslaus the Cruel. These weren't the lumbering brutes of Viking sagas, they were precision killers trained to hack through the Magyars' greatest advantage, their mobility. Each axe blow aimed not at riders, but at the slender legs of their horses, toppling mounts and pinning their notoriously agile archers in the mud. Contemporary chronicles describe the horror as Magyar stallions, arrows still nocked, crash screaming onto their riders, creating a grisly domino effect that choked the battlefield with tangled bodies. Yet the battle's most subversive twist happened off the field. Pope Agapetus II, desperate to counter Byzantine influence in Italy, had secretly promised Otto an imperial crown if he could secure Christendom's eastern flank. This wasn't just spiritual patronage, it was hardball geopolitics. When Otto returned victorious, his army draped in captured Magyar banners, Agapetus made good on his word. The same bishops who'd once scorned Otto's father as a Saxon upstart now anointed him Emperor of the Romans in a carefully staged ceremony. The Holy Roman Empire, that paradoxical beast of medieval Europe, drew its first breath not from ancient tradition, but from a pope's calculated bid for relevance. The Vatican's spin doctors went into overdrive afterward. Magyar raids were recast as apocalyptic hordes in official chronicles, while Otto's mercenary heavy army became a united Christian host. The Bohemians, written out entirely too Slavic for the new imperial mythos, even the battle's location was fudged. Records placed it near Augsburg to tie Otto's victory to Roman roads and ruined forts, grafting his legitimacy onto antiquity's corpse. Lechfeld's legacy hides in plain sight today. Those Magyar survivors who surrendered, Otto settled them as border guards near Vienna, where their descendants would later repel actual steppe invasions. The Bohemian axes, they evolved into the halberds that Swiss mercenaries used to topple Burgundy's knights 4 centuries later, and that imperial title. It became a political wrecking ball, wielded by everyone from Charlemagne to Napoleon, but perhaps the greatest irony is this: the battle that invented medieval Germany was won by outsiders, blessed by foreigners, and rewritten by priests, proof that history's most pivotal moments are rarely as simple as the victors pretend. The emperor's gold never reached the garrison at Manzikert, and with that single payroll failure, Byzantium lost Anatolia forever. The year was 1071, and Romanus Diogenes wasn't just fighting the Seljuk Turks, he was battling his own empire's rot. When his treasury officials skimmed funds meant for Armenian mercenaries, those border guards did something unprecedented. They stepped aside as Sultan Alp Arslan's cavalry rode past, opening the gates of Anatolia to a wave of Turkic migration that would reshape the map of Asia Minor. The battle itself was almost an afterthought, a chaotic melee where Romanus was captured, then bizarrely released after sharing wine with his enemy. But the real story wasn't the emperor's humiliation, it was the economic dominoes that toppled in his wake. Byzantine armies had relied on Armenian auxiliaries for centuries, paying them to guard the mountainous frontier where regular troops couldn't patrol. But endless budget cuts turned these loyal defenders into ticking time bombs. Contemporary payroll records scratched onto wax tablets now gathering dust in Cappadocian caves show soldiers going months without wages, while Constantinople's bureaucrats siphoned taxes into vanity projects. When Romanus marched east to face Alp Arslan, his Armenian units hadn't been paid in half a year. Their betrayal wasn't ideological, it was arithmetic. Why die for an empire that wouldn't even feed your family? The Seljuks, meanwhile, were masters of psychological warfare. Alp Arslan didn't just offer deserters back pay, he gave them land grants along newly conquered trade routes, transforming disgruntled mercenaries into stakeholders of his expanding realm. Byzantine defectors found themselves governing caravanserais, collecting tolls from the very merchants they'd once protected. Within a generation, these former border guards had become Turkic nobility, their children speaking Persian and Arabic instead of Armenian. The real conquest wasn't by sword, but by spreadsheet, a slow-motion takeover where payroll ledgers proved deadlier than scimitars. What makes Manzikert's legacy so tragic is how preventable it was. Romanus had actually won earlier skirmishes against the Seljuks, proving Byzantine tactics still worked when properly funded. Even after his capture, Alp Arslan initially demanded only modest border adjustments, nothing compared to the wholesale collapse that followed. But the emperor's political rivals in Constantinople saw an opportunity. Rather than rallying to his defense, they overthrew him, plunging the empire into civil war while Turkic bands poured into undefended Anatolia. The grasslands that had fed Constantinople for 7 centuries, the recruiting grounds for its finest troops, were gone within a decade, not because of battlefield losses, but because bureaucrats prioritized palace coups over pastureland. The battle's ghost still haunts modern geopolitics. Those Armenian turncoats' descendants became the janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, while Anatolia's Greek and Armenian communities dwindled into minority enclaves. Even today, Turkey's eastern borders roughly follow the 11th century frontier, where Byzantine paymasters first decided some soldiers weren't worth the cost. Manzikert teaches us a brutal lesson. Empires rarely fall to outsiders until they've first been hollowed out from within. The Seljuk arrows that struck Romanus were merely the punctuation mark. The real story was written in empty treasuries and broken promises, one stolen gold coin at a time. The summer of 1298 found the Scottish rebels in an impossible position. William Wallace's guerrilla tactics had humiliated England's knights at Stirling Bridge, but now Edward I arrived with something far deadlier than armored cavalry, Welsh conscripts armed with 6-foot yew bows. Falkirk wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal lesson in how empires weaponize the very people they've conquered. While Hollywood remembers Wallace's martyrdom, the real story lies in the mud beneath Welsh boots, where ethnic resentment and military pragmatism collided to redefine medieval warfare forever. Edward's gamble was as cynical as it was brilliant. Just decades earlier, his father had butchered thousands of Welshmen in crushing their independence. Now he drafted their surviving sons into his army, offering meager wages but a priceless commodity, permission to vent their rage on someone else. These weren't professional soldiers, they were herdsmen and farmers, their fingers calloused from decades of pulling bowstrings against English tax collectors. At Falkirk, Edward positioned them in alternating blocks with crossbow mercenaries from Gascony, creating a killing field where cultural grudges became England's greatest asset. Wallace's schiltrons, dense spear formations that had butchered cavalry at Stirling, stood no chance against arrows shot at point-blank range by men who knew how to punch through oak at 200 paces. But the true scandal wasn't the slaughter, it was the aftermath. English chroniclers, desperate to preserve the myth of chivalry, downplayed the Welsh role, crediting Edward's genius rather than admitting his army's backbone was cobbled together from hated subjects. The Welsh archers themselves vanished from records, their pay stubs revealing a darker truth. Many were paid not in coin, but in looted Scottish grain, turning them into accomplices in their own exploitation. Meanwhile, Edward's generals took notes. Falkirk proved that disciplined missile troops could decimate traditional infantry at minimal cost, a revelation that would culminate a century later at Agincourt. The battle's legacy twists deeper when you follow the arrow's path. Those same Welsh bows would later be turned against their own villages during Owain Glyndwr's rebellion, their design copied by English craftsmen who erased their origins. Wallace's defeat didn't just break Scotland's resistance, it forged a blueprint for imperial control, where the conquered are made to enforce their own subjugation. Today, Falkirk's monument shows Wallace gazing heroically at the horizon, but history's real lesson lies in the unmarked graves of the archers who killed him, men who win a battle only to lose themselves. From Brunnenberg's blood-soaked fields to Falkirk's rain of arrows, these 25 battles aren't just footnotes, they're the hidden hinges of history, swinging entire civilizations onto paths we still walk today. Think about it, the Treaty of Troyes that nearly erased France from the map, the silver mines of Novo Biardio funding cannons that would topple Constantinople, the Bohemian axes at Lechfeld that accidentally birthed the Holy Roman Empire. These aren't dusty tales from forgotten chronicles, they're the dominoes that shaped our world, knocked over by men who never guessed their choices would ripple through time. What's truly haunting isn't just how these battles vanished from memory, it's why victors rewrite history to fit their myths, losers bury their shame, and sometimes the truth is just too messy for neat textbooks. The Mongol engineers at Mohai built bridges in darkness that predated modern sappers by centuries, yet we remember them as savages. The Lombard League's Carroccio wagon at Legnano became a blueprint for democracy, yet Renaissance scholars airbrushed it out to glorify Roman antiquity. History isn't a straight line, it's a palimpsest with the most important stories often scrawled beneath the surface. So here's the challenge: next time you hear about some epoch-making battle, ask what got left out. For every Hastings, there's a Stamford Bridge, the real turning point that exhausted an army before the famous clash. For every Crusader victory, there's a Nicopolis, where vanity bankrolled the enemy's next triumph. The past isn't a parade of inevitabilities, it's a web of might-have-beens, where a single river crossing or a withheld payroll could have rewritten everything. Want to keep unraveling these threads? The descriptions packed with books and documentaries that go deeper, like the archaeology proving Teutonic knights at Tannenberg were bludgeoned with farming tools, or the Florentine bank records exposing Cracy's financial fallout. Drop your most jaw-dropping discovery in the comments. Was it Dorostolon's spy turning the tide, or the Welsh bows at Falkirk that backfired on England itself? And don't miss next week's deep dive into medieval Europe's most brazen lies, from unchivalrous tactics that won wars to the forged relics that filled coffers. Hit subscribe, because history's greatest stories aren't the ones shouting from textbooks, they're the whispers waiting in the margins. Until then, keep listening for echoes. The quietest battles, they're the ones that never really ended.